For a very short period of my life, I want to say it was around the time I was the age of 15 or 16, I lived in a fairly small house in Vermont. My family didn't live there long. It was located in the forest and far from almost everything, making any task that required leaving the house pretty inconvenient. However, there's one experience I had at that house in the time I lived there that I'll likely never forget. It happened in January. I only remember that because I can recall New Year's Day being just a few days earlier. My cousin Jason and I were both still on school break at the time and had planned to spend the night at my place. This was something we would often do. We would typically stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. playing Xbox, watching movies, or something along those lines. This would all happen in the living room. This night, we had been watching a movie. I don't remember what movie it was, but that's not important. What I do remember is being maybe halfway through the movie when Jason kept looking out the window, just slightly to the right of where we were sitting. It got to the point where like every minute I could see his head move out of the corner of my eye. Now, I should mention, on that night there was a fairly bad snowstorm happening. At first, I just thought he had been watching the snowfall, until I realized just how long he had been staring out the window for. I asked him what he was looking at. He kept staring, and responded saying how he thought he saw something. This instantly filled me with anxiety. I think this was mostly due to where we lived. Wild animals weren't all that common, and like I mentioned earlier, we didn't really live near anything. So someone on our property, especially at this hour and during a snowstorm, would 100% be cause for concern. Nothing happened for a couple minutes. I kept asking follow-up questions, but he just told me to be quiet, like as if to be able to focus. That's when we saw it. The clear shadow of a person sprinting from one tree to the next. Both of us physically jumped in reaction. There was no sound, but the sheer sight alone was enough to startle us. Now, this was a good 200 feet out from the house, so we couldn't exactly tell if the person was coming closer or not. We both looked at each other, and right back out the window, I guess as a way to confirm what we just saw. A couple minutes of this went by, when it happened again, but this time much further to the left of where the first sighting had occurred. Slowly over time, the sightings would become more frequent. It was clear by this point that there was more than just one person. Eventually, one of the figures got out from behind a tree, but this time, instead of moving behind another one, it just stood there. And after a couple seconds, the figure started sprinting in our direction. This was enough to break us out of our sort of trance of disbelief we were in and run. I ran straight upstairs to wake up my dad. But by the time he got up and followed me downstairs, there was no one visible outside. Jason and I both explained to him what we had seen. Typically, I don't think my dad would have believed us, but I guess he was able to see the genuine panic in our eyes. We all went around the house, verifying all the doors and windows were locked. My dad then went outside armed with a weapon. He briefly walked around the house before returning inside, but he found nothing. That night, we convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us. Come morning, and the snowstorm had almost completely stopped. We went outside to better assess the situation in the daylight, and we would find multiple sets of footprints in the snow next to the trees facing our living room's window. They were pretty filled in from the snowstorm, but still clearly visible and recognizable as footprints. There were even some around the house, like on top of the footprints my dad had made the night before. I even talked to my dad about it, and he said those had not been there when he went outside. Even more disturbing was how our shed had been left completely open, with the only things stolen being our knives we used for hunting. None of this, however, would be enough to get my dad to call the cops. He always had this we take care of our own mentality, and I guess he just never saw calling 911 as an option. We moved out of that house 2 weeks later. Not because of the incident, rather that just so happened to be when we had planned to move. I was extremely grateful for this. At least as far as I know, nothing happened in those 2 weeks. This whole experience still freaks me out to this day. Seeing firsthand multiple people on your isolated property in the middle of the night and during a snowstorm is straight out of a nightmare, and I do my best not to think about it. This all happened during the winter months of 2014. Around that time, my dad got a new job that required us to move. Not a small move. It was a good 9 hours away from the house I grew up in. We hired a moving truck, but we still had the task of getting our car down to the new house. This time of year also happened to be around the time I was learning to drive. I guess my dad thought 9 hours on the highway would be good practice for me. So the plan was me and my dad would drive the car down to the new house, while my mom and my sisters would fly. I wasn't exactly looking forward to the drive. Not because of the time, I didn't really mind that part. I was more so worried about the blizzard my phone was showing we would hit halfway into our trip. Driving in the snow as a new driver is not something I really ever wanted to experience. My dad dismissed this though, telling me it wasn't that bad, and for the most part would just feel the same as normal driving. Anyway, we left at around 3 p.m., so we were set to get to the new house at around midnight. Come around 8 p.m., and yeah, we got hit by the blizzard. It was a lot more extreme than I'd imagined it would be. Although, my dad must have trusted my inexperienced driving for whatever reason, as he never once said anything about him wanting to take over the wheel. So, I kept going. Eventually, my nightmare would come true. I lost control of the car, and we were sent sliding off the road and towards a line of trees. In the moment, I tried my best to avoid them, but the car slightly grazed one of them. Luckily, I don't think my dad was that mad. It's not like we hit a tree head-on at full speed. We got out to assess the damage, and by some miracle, there was nothing but a slight scratch on the back passenger side door. I held back a laugh of genuine relief. Just then, I noticed a vehicle coming up the road with some extremely bright high beams on. As it got closer, it started honking, and continued doing so until it pulled up right next to us. The guy rolled down his window. I figured he was going to ask us if we needed help. But no, he looked at us and began some awkward small talk, completely ignoring the situation we were currently in. My dad just kind of looked at the dude and told him we didn't have time to talk and asked what he needed. The guy responded with something like, I just noticed you dropped something about a mile back. I think it fell into your trunk. Now, we did have a few things in our trunk that we didn't send with the moving truck, but there was no way any of it could have fallen out, or at least I thought. I looked at my dad and asked him if there was any way something could have fallen out. My dad started his response, but was interrupted by the man saying, "Well, you must have, because I was right behind you. It's in my back seat here. Why don't you go ahead and get it so I can get out of here?" I figured it couldn't hurt to look, just in case we actually had dropped something somehow. But right as I put my hand on the guy's backseat door handle, my dad abruptly yelled at me, saying that we didn't lose anything, and to get back in our car immediately. A few seconds of silence, with my hand still on the door handle, went by. Yelling was completely out of character for my dad, though I eventually listened to him and got back in our car. We drove off, with not another word being said by either us or the guy. I couldn't help but notice the extremely disturbing and almost angry face of the driver as we drove past him. Once we got a few miles down the road, my dad would apologize for yelling at me. I of course told him it was fine, just that I wasn't really expecting it. I will never forget what he said next. He said he felt like he had to, because while I was heading towards the guy's back door, through the window he could just barely make out the silhouettes of two men waiting on the other side. He would further explain that by the looks of their movements as I was walking towards the door, upon opening the door, I would either be attacked, kidnapped, or worse. Hearing this was a complete shock to me, but to this day, I'm still glad my dad told me what he saw. It taught me at a young age that not everyone has the best intentions in this world. However, at the end of the day, we can't 100% confirm the guy had bad intentions. But I myself truly believe my dad's instincts were correct. The whole situation just didn't add up. Why would there have been two men waiting right at the door for me to open it? And on top of that, when we got to our new house, we were able to verify that nothing was missing from our trunk. Thinking about this whole experience still scares me, even today. This happened when I was 18. I had just finished up my first semester of college, and a couple friends I had met there planned to rent out a cabin on some lake over the weekend through Airbnb. They asked if I wanted to go, and I said yeah. I didn't really know much about the destination, but I decided I'd go regardless. I was done with finals, and honestly felt like I could just use some solid time away from it all. So, my two friends and I, who I'll just call Brad and Dustin, were set to leave. The cabin was about an hour away. When we arrived, we unpacked the stuff we brought for the weekend and got settled inside. The first night was honestly kinda creepy, at least for me, because the cabin was pretty remote. It was the only one on the lake, and as far as I'm concerned, it was the only one within miles of nothing but forest. I'm someone who's used to being in cities with lots of people, not quiet forests with the occasional howl of coyotes. Needless to say, it was for sure a scene I would have to get used to. But all things considered, the first night was completely fine. It was the second night where things took a turn. All throughout the second day, a blizzard took place outside. We didn't really plan for it. I guess none of us thought to check the weather before making the trip. I mean, you gotta remember, all three of us were only 18 at the time, so not the brightest. Anyway, on the second night, Brad and I slept in our own bedrooms upstairs, while Dustin slept on a couch downstairs. I think it was around 2 a.m. when Dustin went upstairs and woke both of us up saying how the outside motion light kept turning on and off again. Brad told him it was most likely just an animal activating it, or the light simply being activated by the motion of the falling snow. But what Dustin responded with was pretty terrifying. He explained how that's what he thought too, but after looking outside, he saw what he described as something resembling the shadow of a person, and around 6 foot tall. This definitely freaked us out a bit, but Brad, who was still convinced it had to be an animal, said he would go downstairs to check it out. And so that's what he did. Meanwhile, Dustin and I stayed upstairs. A good 3 minutes went by, when a blood-curdling scream rang out downstairs. Dustin and I ran downstairs as fast as we could. Brad was lying on the floor and pointing at the living room window. We looked out the window, but there was nothing. He practically screamed at us to go upstairs, and so the three of us did. The rooms in the cabin didn't have locks, so we resorted to barricading ourselves in one of the bedrooms. Brad quietly explained to us that when he got downstairs, he started by looking out all the kitchen windows, and when he didn't see anything, he made his way to the living room window. He pulled back the curtain, and at first saw nothing, but not nothing like an empty snowy forest. He literally saw pure black darkness. Confused, he cupped his hands to his eyes and got closer to the window. But that's when he realized it was a person blocking the view. He then screamed and fell back. Now, at this point, I hadn't seen anything myself. Don't get me wrong, I was still horrified. But in the back of my mind, I still wasn't ruling out the fact that they might have just been imagining things. Just then, the power cut out. It felt like my heart had completely stopped for at least 5 seconds. I was now hysterical at this point. All doubt I had in the sightings Brad and Dustin experienced instantly vanished. I genuinely felt like my life was over in that moment. We had no weapons, and worse yet, no phone service. All we could do was sit and wait until daylight. Fortunately, nothing further would occur in that time. Once the sun was up, we took down the barricade and all started getting our stuff. We had no intentions of staying there any longer than we needed to. It was still snowing, but luckily the vehicle we brought was good in the snow. Before we left, we took a quick survey of the outside area around the cabin. There were no footprints, but this was likely because they were filled in by the snow. This had to have been the case, as there were no footprints by the fuse box outside, yet it was completely destroyed. It looked like it was smashed in multiple times by an axe. The sight of this was enough to get us to leave immediately. Later we tried contacting the Airbnb owner, but we got no response. I always thought this was weird. I mean, if your fuse box got completely destroyed, I'd imagine you'd want to talk to the people renting the cabin at the time. But no, not even a text back from the guy. I stayed friends with Brad and Dustin throughout the rest of college. We would talk about the experience from time to time, but for the most part we kept it to ourselves. We still don't know who was stalking us in the woods that night, or what their intentions were.
When I was young, my parents moved around a lot. I must have attended 10 different schools during my life. My dad was the kind of man who shouldn't have had kids. He wouldn't keep a steady job and forced my mother and later my aunt to work long hours to support our family, which included 6 kids. He was a schemer and always looking for an angle to work. My earliest memories were bar fights and my dad robbing my piggy bank while he was drunk in the middle of the night. My mom followed him like a god. To this day, I don't understand why. He was physically violent with her, and she stayed with him for over 20 years until all the kids had grown. I guess she stayed for us more than anything. The story actually begins when I was 10 years old. My dad outfitted an old school bus with bunks, and we traveled across the country from Utah to Indiana and finally to Kentucky, where the bus engine died. So the bus was our home for a long time, until Dad finally rented what could only be described as a shack on the side of a mountain. This was near Burkesville, in what is known as the Cumberland Gap. Very mountainous with steep hills, with gravel roads carved into the mountains. The house we rented was from an old man named Howard, who owned a gas station and convenience store where 2 roads intersected. Howard was a good old man who took a liking to my dad. He used to give us the flat sodas from his gas station when we were waiting on the bus. For us, it was a very rare treat to drink anything more than water. There were 6 of us kids altogether. Marty, who was just a baby, Michael, who was in kindergarten, my sisters Jean and Carol Ann, who were in 3rd, and my brother Jim, who was in the 2nd grade. I was the oldest in 4th grade. We would walk down a steep gravel road that was about a quarter of a mile from the house each day to the bus stop. I remember the gravel road was overgrown and had old houses that were dilapidated on both sides. The town had been part of the company housing for a coal mine that closed up back in the 50s. Kudzu and vines covered houses. Old trucks and cars that were no more than rust piles lined the sides of the road, looking out of the brush as if they were trying to hide. Howard called it the Coal Mine Road. The house we lived in was at the top of the hill from the gas station, then about a quarter mile down Coal Mine Road on the right. It was the only house not grown over with kudzu and weeds. The road kept going to a clearing where Howard had an oil rig. I remember there were copperhead snakes, and we'd keep ourselves at the center of the road so no one would get snake bit. Sometimes they would come out onto the gravel and warm in the sun, especially early in the morning. We would throw gravel at them to keep them back. We were warned never to venture off the path because Howard had told us that there were hidden dangers all around. Old cellars that had caved in, uncovered wells, and of course, the snakes. Mom was very careful to keep us all near or in the house as much as she could. But being the oldest boy, I would be sent out to get coal from a coal pile. A potbelly stove was all we had for heat. It was a chance to goof off and look around, throwing old rocks at the windows of those old houses I could see through the woods. One day, Mama asked me to go out and bring in some coal. I was watching TV on a black and white TV set in the bedroom, and I didn't want to get up. So I acted like I didn't hear Mom ask. She finally came in the room fussing and said that if I didn't get the coal right now, it would be dark. So out I went. We had an old wheelbarrow that we used to bring the coal up to the house. Then we'd take a few large pieces in and put them beside the stove. For those of you who don't know, coal is very dirty, and it gets all over you. The old wheelbarrow had a steel wheel that needed grease and would squeal as you pushed it down the road and over to a pile of coal that Howard had brought out for us to keep warm. In a lot of ways, I think Howard worried about us in that old drafty house. This was sort of his way of helping. It was already dark when I shoveled the last of the coal into the wheelbarrow and turned toward the house. Then I saw something. On the road past our home, there was a light. It was dim like an old lantern. Dad wasn't home, that I knew. He was working at a blue jean factory 4 hours away, and he wouldn't be home until Friday. The light bobbed as it came slowly up the road, like someone walking. There was nothing down that road now, no reason for anyone to be coming up from the old oil rig and coal mine, and if it was Howard, he would have taken his truck instead of walking. And yet here it was, a dim yellow light that seemed to keep a steady pace toward me. I gave the wheelbarrow a push. Then I stopped. If they didn't know I was here now, that would have told them. I dropped the handles of the wheelbarrow and made a run for the house, hoping I could beat the lantern carrier. As I ran the 100 yards or so to the house, the lantern grew closer, but kept its steady pace, not pausing. I could see it was a lamp, flickering with a very dirty, dusty glass cover. I could make out a single person in the light of the lamp as it swung at the end of the arm, walking ever closer to me and my home. I burst through the door of the house and yelled, "Mama, there's someone out there on the road, behind the house." Mom came out of the kitchen and came to a halt just inside the living room. There was no doubt based on my face that I'd seen something. I wasn't overly afraid of the dark, and Mom knew that. I didn't spook easily, and she knew I was usually the one who got rid of the snakes and defended the younger kids from bullies. She said in a calm voice, "Lock the door." I ran back to the front door and shut it quickly, not taking time to look for the lantern. I turned the old deadbolt lock and a homemade wooden lock we had made with a nail and a flat piece of wood. Mom came into the living room with a single 16-gauge shotgun. Her dad gave her that gun, and that may be the only reason we still had it, because she refused to let Dad sell it. By this time, the other kids were coming into the room. She told them in a hushed voice to go to the bedroom and lock the door. It must have been the tone of her voice, because they did exactly that. I could hear Marty crying behind the door and my oldest sister hushing him. She walked around cutting off lights, the kitchen, the hall where the potbelly stove was, the living room. The house had those old string lights to a single bulb, so as each light went out, the house grew very dark. The only light was the light of the porch light and the light from under the bedroom door. Mama began to peek out the windows. First, she looked out the kitchen window. The back door was locked, I could see. She peeked out the small window in the door then, and then the living room windows, then the bathroom. Nothing. She turns to me and asks, "Are you sure you saw someone?" I answered quickly, "Yes, they had a lantern and were walking up the road." "From the mine?" She was looking at me intently with a furrowed brow now, her voice raised like she was questioning the information. "You better be telling me the truth," she responded flatly, rechecking each window. I was hurt and at the same time angered by her lack of belief. I then started checking the windows myself, but I didn't see anything either. Finally, Mom opens the front door and steps out on the porch. She goes to the edge and looks up and down the road. I peeked out from behind her and didn't see anything either. The moon was above the trees now, and you could see clearly there wasn't anyone on the road. I guess it would be easy enough to turn off the lantern and slip into the woods, but why? We didn't have any kind of flashlight, so we had to just strain our eyes and see what we could. Nothing moved. No noises came from the woods, but we could hear the other kids bumping around in the bedroom. We went back inside and shut the door. She put the shotgun in the corner by the door and looked at me with surprising compassion after such a scare. "Maybe we have enough coal for the night." She smiled at me. "I really saw something, Mama." I once again insisted. "Maybe it was Howard. We'll ask him in the morning." She walked back to the kitchen, leaving me standing by the door, The next morning, I woke to a very cold house. No one else was up, but the fire had burned down to cinders, and there wasn't any more coal in the house. I got up, slid on my pants and shoes. I went to the front door and saw the shotgun was still in the corner by the door, where Mama had left it the night before. I peeked out the living room window. Everything that had happened the night before returning fresh to my memory. Unlocking the front door, I opened it and I looked outside. My mouth dropped open. The wheelbarrow filled with the coal I'd loaded the night before was now just sitting on the porch. Someone had taken the wheelbarrow to the house and up the 5 steps to the porch without anyone hearing it. One more thing. Sitting on top of the coal was an old kerosene lantern. I poked my head out into the brisk air. I thought it was cold in the house until that frosty October morning met my bare arms and face. I looked up and down the old road and around the house, no sign of anyone. I brought in a couple of pieces of coal and started up the fire. We never did find out who my mystery helper was. We found out later that day that Howard had been out of town at a doctor's office in Versailles, and Dad didn't come home until later that Saturday afternoon. Howard said it looked like one of the old lanterns in an old storage shed near the entrance of the mine. Dad, Howard, and I walked out the road the next day. I remember I had a hard time keeping up, it was so grown over. Howard toted an old black revolver, and Dad had Mom's shotgun. First, we went to the old shed. The door was bolted, and the padlock was rusted beyond opening. We then traipsed through the tall weeds and kudzu until dark, checking each of the old houses. But they were all still boarded up. There were no signs of entry, except for some broken-out windows that were probably from my rocks. From that day forward, I went out early to get the coal, with the exception of a few really cold nights. Those nights I did venture out after dark, I took my lantern.
My name is Harry, and this happened about 9 years ago when I was 10 years old. Growing up, it was just me, my brother, and my mom. We didn't have a lot of money and we moved around a lot, most of the time in rough neighborhoods. We moved into an apartment building when I was about 10 years old. It didn't take us long to get settled in. My mom gave my brother and me a task to help out. My brother would go out and get groceries and work side jobs if he could, and my task was to do the laundry. One day I went down to the first floor with a basket full of laundry. I walked into the laundromat and started putting clothes into the machine. That's when a man walked in with a laundry basket of his own. He was about in his early 40s. Light bright hair that was slicked back and big 70s style glasses. He didn't say anything, but every now and then I would look across the laundromat and would see him staring at me. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help but check, especially when you're being watched. After some time, the man left the laundromat, which left me feeling relieved. Later that day, after finishing laundry, I was heading outside with my brother and a new friend to play baseball. Before exiting the building, I looked to my left down the corridor to the laundromat, and I saw that same man from earlier. He was peering around the corner, looking into the laundromat. What was he doing, I thought? Was he actually looking for me? He was being very sneaky. I left the building before he had a chance to turn around and see me. About 3 or 4 days passed before I needed to do laundry again. The first thing I saw when I walked into the laundromat was that man. This time he spoke and said, "Hey, I didn't know you liked baseball," while giving me an unsettling smile. How did he know I liked baseball, I thought. Has he been watching me, following me? I said, "Oh yeah," while letting out an awkward fake laugh. I walked past the man and towards a washing machine. The man didn't say anything. Instead, he just stood there watching me again, still with a weird smile. Thankfully though, he left shortly after I was able to continue doing my laundry. One evening I was bored and I think there was some electrical problem in our apartment. Because of that, I wasn't able to play video games or watch TV. So I decided to do something productive and do some laundry. I went down to the laundromat and began doing the load. That's when the lights started flickering. and at the same time the man came into the laundromat. As soon as I saw him, I felt faint. He walked slowly up to me, looking up at the lights flickering, and said, "I think there's going to be a power outage." I looked up at the lights as well and said nervously, "Yeah, I think so too." I looked at the man, and he just gave me a creepy grin, just like before. At that point, the power did cut off, and the laundromat, along with the rest of the building, went dark. I was stuck in the dark laundromat alone with this man. He then grabbed both of my arms really tight and pulled me close to him, and he said to me, "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. It's only the dark. It's fine." Before I could say anything to tell him to let me go, he covered my mouth with his hand, then whispered to me saying, "Shh, it's okay. Don't worry." I remember thinking at that point I was about to die, thinking that that man was about to take me away. And it was pitch black in the building after all, and the exit to the building was just down the corridor. The lights then flickered back on, and the man said to me, "See? I said everything's gonna be okay," then letting me go from his tight grip. I remember standing there frightened, the man walking past me, and he left the laundromat. I never saw that man again after that, so I never mentioned it again. I sometimes think if the lights didn't come back on, would he have tried to take me away, or worse?